I will keep admitting people as they pop up here, but it's 6 o'clock, and I think we should. It's a kind of robust presentation. And thank you so much to everybody who hopped on the Zoom tonight. I think we'll probably have more people coming in as we go, but I am excited to see folks joining the conversation about this really important topic. This meeting is being recorded, so just keep that in mind. We are recording so that we can then share it with people in the community who could not make it tonight. I am going to ask folks who are in the Zoom to keep yourself on mute and hold any verbal questions to the end of the presentation. Nick's going to go through the presentation. During that time, if you want to drop any questions or comments into the chat, we'll try and address those as he wraps up. And then we'll hopefully have a little time for more kind of conversational feedback toward the very end. We're due to be wrapped up promptly by 7 at the very latest. So we'll be moving through information in a way that's, efficient, but gives you still time to look at everything. And I think, let me know if I missed anything, folks, but I think that's all from me for kicking us off. And I'm going to turn things over to Nick Stellitano. Nick is from Dillinger, which is the group that is helping us with this process. They have great expertise in working with the type of software that allows us to look at different models, and also just working with districts on all the sort of softer part of the process, making sure we're doing outreach and giving plenty of opportunity for voice and input. So Nick, it's all you. Take it away.
And thank you very much, Superintendent, and good evening, everybody. As the Superintendent mentioned, my name is Nick Stellitano. I'm the Managing Director of Dillinger Research and Applied Data. We're here tonight to start to really engage, hopefully with a wide range of folks from the community around some initial scenarios that we've started to develop for the redistricting process. And so, as the superintendent mentioned, I'll be going through a fairly robust set of slides, but with the intent of leaving time at the end for questions, for comments, and really emphasizing the idea that we do want to hear from you all. And so it doesn't just have to be comments, but if you have sort of ideas, thoughts, and sort of input that you would like to provide to the process, please, we encourage that level of engagement. For those that may or may not be video shy, so to speak, feel free to, as the superintendent mentioned, put any of your questions in the chat. We will endeavor to either get to them during the meeting, or if we do run out of time because we're trying to give space for folks to talk, we will make sure to answer the questions in a follow-up, FAQ, and get that posted to the website. So thank you all very much for coming, and we will jump right into it. So really quickly, in terms of who we are, Dillinger Research and Applied Data is a Connecticut-based nonprofit. We are constantly engaging with districts, nonprofits, and state-level entities around all things data, specifically to engage with hard problems, research questions, or in general implementation challenges, and that the overall desire is to use data to move to a better set of solutions that work best for the district, the school, et cetera. Specifically, why we're here today, excuse me, is to help the Westborough School District rethink its attendance zones specifically for the 3 elementary schools. And so just, full disclaimer, the redistricting process that we are talking about and that we will be talking about is only for those 3 elementary schools, Armstrong, Fales, and Hastings. And so part of the process is thinking about what works for the district now, but then also thinking about what that looks like over the coming 5 to 10 years. So when we think about the project and we think about the objectives, there are a few established objectives that we want to make sure that we accomplish throughout this whole process. First and foremost, and this was really established through the school committee engagement, was to better utilize the space available at Fales Elementary School. We have all of the principals here on our call tonight. As most should be probably aware, Fales is Westborough's newest building. It was created and opened in 2021, and it represents really, I think, a rich opportunity to engage with how Westborough both envisions the educational process and thinking about all of the new resources that are available. So it is to, I think, everybody's interest to think critically about how can we maximize the Fales Fales Elementary School. Just as a quick example, the current enrollment for Fales is at 281. And it represents the lowest enrollment across the three elementary schools. We want to promote long-term enrollment stability and equitable class sizes across the elementary school system, and then really think about how we can create a very similar student experience across all K-3 elementary schools. And so as we know that Fales is low in terms of enrollment, I think it's fair to say Armstrong and Hastings is actually pretty high in terms of their enrollment, which creates unique challenges for each school in terms of how they best manage their utilization. And so when we think about that similar student experience, really what we're also trying to think through is how can we lessen the stresses on Armstrong and Hastings to, again, create that similar experience. So this project did start mid-October, and so just really quickly identifying what work has been done so far. We've had a plethora of meetings with a bunch of different stakeholders to include the school committee, both October 8th and just recently this past week on December 3rd. We've met with the community writ large. We hosted an in-person community forum on November 3rd at the middle school. We did want to make sure that we were providing different ways in which to engage, and so this time around we are meeting virtually. You can expect us to do this again come January. We have a strategic working group that we've established that has a cross-representation of both staff, principals, and parents, and district members, but specifically from all three schools. That strategic working group is really meant to help advise and provide input around this whole design process. Important to note, they are not the deciding body, nor is Dillinger Research and Applied Data. The final set of recommendations will be provided to the school committee late January, in which they will come to the final decision and make the final vote. In terms of public surveys, in terms of meetings as well, we've also tried to really think about how we're meeting everybody in terms of different parents and families across the district. And so we've tried to engage with the virtual ESL meetings or English as a second language meetings for parents that take place usually weekly. And so we've tried to push out that information as well. We've also established a website where you can find all of the different materials that we've been providing to different stakeholders throughout the past month and a half. We did have a public survey that was open from November 3rd to December 3rd. We will be doing that again following this meeting. For that public survey, we did have 52 responses, providing us some input around, what are some considerations in terms of the current boundaries, in terms of thinking about challenges in regards to Westborough overall, and different considerations that we should take as we move through this process. We've partnered with both the district and the town in which to collect as much data as we can to conduct a demographic and enrollment analysis, which will be helping feed into the scenarios. And then as we will go through tonight, we'll be going over the 5 initial scenarios created. So the agenda for this evening is really quickly going across the current landscape of Armstrong's, Fales, and Hastings, the scenario development in terms of what were the objectives, what are some of the constraints, and what are some of the strategic areas that we're considering, and then diving into the 5 scenarios along with opening up the floor for those key questions from the community. One thing I did want to sort of emphasize in terms of the current landscape, for the purpose of this mildly quick meeting of an hour, we did want to condense some of the slides. And so generally speaking, this is the presentation that we gave to the school committee last week. However, if you're interested, we did do a little bit more of an individual deep dive across each school to provide a little bit more clarity in regards to some of the decisions that we're thinking. We endeavored to try to do that again tonight, but more condensed. So if you are looking for a little bit more of a deeper dive, feel free to go back to the school committee video that is published on the school committee's website, and you can get a more in-depth review of that. So in terms of, again, just setting the current landscape across the 3 elementary schools, it's important to note that overall enrollment has been decreasing over the last decade in terms of Westborough. Here, in terms of this chart, you can basically see the overall enrollment for the entire district broken out by different grade bands. So down here, you can see the PK, orange is your K to 3, green is your 4 to 5, etc. And so really the emphasis that we're sort of also focusing on beyond just the overall district enrollment is this orange set of bars right here, which again, in similar to the overall Westborough enrollment, has been slightly declining over the past 10 years. And so when we think about how that looks in comparison to how overall Westborough's demographic population and enrollment population is changing, you actually start to see a more diverse population kind of taking shape here in Westborough, which is quite exciting. And so here on the bottom, you can see that the Asian population has generally increased slightly from 25% to hovering closer to probably 30%. Your overall Hispanic population has increased, while your Black and non-Hispanic multi-race combinations have generally stayed somewhat consistent, if not slightly increasing a little bit. In terms of the landscape of Westborough, because when we start to think about redistricting, part of the process is thinking about your geography and thinking about where people are moving to and from. And so here on the right-hand side, what we tried to do was kind of indicate, generally speaking, where are the pockets across the entire Westborough? Are we seeing increases in enrollment, and are we seeing decreases in enrollment? So for those that might not be familiar, these dotted lines represent the current boundaries between Fales, which is your southernmost elementary school, Armstrong, which is your westernmost elementary school, and then Hastings, which encompasses your north and eastern portion. And so, interestingly, you can see, and I do apologize. We will do better next time in terms of the legend. Your dark green, which is in the northern portion and the western portion, are showing fairly significant increases in the enrollment population. And so the way you should incorporate this is where kids are living or where families are living. These areas right here are where we're seeing an increase in essentially school-aged children. Your light greens could be a little bit of decreasing or could be increasing. And so next time when we do this, we'll make sure to kind of divide it so that it's 0 is the dividing line. But you can see that we have a mixed bag, so to speak, on your eastern portion of Westborough and just in this northern western portion. And then you start to get into the all negatives or the declining in terms of enrollment. And so here on the western portion and on the southern portion, you're seeing fairly significant decreases in either families with school-aged children or just, school-aged children in general. So this obviously kind of creates somewhat of a challenge, because if Fales Elementary School is our newest building and that's where we want to see an increase in enrollment, we can't just accept the fact that if in time enrollment will eventually increase, because the trends currently over the past 10 years has been showing quite the opposite, that the overall trend in the Fales southern portion is decreasing. Part of this whole concept and part of this whole process is really considering the multifamily residential developments. And that is, I think, a unique aspect. Each district that we work with is unique in its own aspect. Here specifically, you can see there are wide swaths of areas, and I'll kind of point us down here in Fales, where there are no multifamily housing units. There is this one that we've sort of identified here that's actually a senior living facility, and so not quite the demographic that we're looking for in terms of thinking about where families are potentially going to move in. And so here up above, you can see that in black are all the current multifamily housing units, as well as in these purple boxes are town-approved multifamily housing developments. And so these are ones that we are expecting to be built over the next couple of years. The black spots are ones that are currently in existence and house a fair amount of the population. Over the past 10 years for the entire district, 10 years ago, it was about 24% of the population was living in multifamily housing. That has since increased to 33%. So the trend, generally speaking, is moving towards these big multifamily housing units. And you can see that it also creates constraints here, because if Hastings and Armstrong are sort of reaching the maximum amount of capacity that they have for their current youth, you can see that we're sort of setting ourselves up for potential challenges in the future, depending on how, I will say, popular and how many families move into these different residents. One thing I do want to sort of emphasize, and this will become a broader conversation, is there is a multifamily housing unit. It is Westborough Village. It is currently located in specifically the Armstrong district. But as you can see, and this happened about 10 years ago, it was decided to reassign that multifamily housing unit to Fales Elementary. So for the past 10 years, individuals up here, even though they are within Armstrong proper, has been moved down, or is rather, I should say, is assigned to Fales Elementary School. And so every day a bus comes, picks all the kids up, and drives them to Fales.
Nick, there's a question that popped up in the chat here that's
Please.
kind of timely to this particular slide. And it asks about whether that 33% is inclusive of school age population, or is it everybody? Because if it's 33%, the question is it inclusive of retirement homes,
No, it is just students.
just student
Yeah, it
age
was just
population?
the PK-12 population.
Okay. And so we don't really have that figure from the town for the overall population
Which
for
I'm
multifamily.
happy to sort of like look into that and incorporate that
Great.
into future slides.
And for Odo, who asked the question, if we didn't quite get that right, we can loop back around to it at the end. Thanks for putting that in.
Great. So part of the process when we're starting to think about, where our kids living and how our families sort of moving in, another aspect when we think about sort of the student experience at each school and what different demographic subgroups are each school sort of educating. Part of what we like to look at is SWD and LEP. And so I'll stop because I've learned this lesson. So SWD is students with disabilities, also known as special education. And then LEP is, and I'm going to look to the superintendent because I messed this up last time.
Limited English proficiency.
Thank you. Limited English proficiency, which are essentially youth who've come in that maybe English isn't their second language, and they need additional supports to get spooled up in regards to speaking English. So here, and it's important to note these two demographics specifically because the district is allocating additional resources to each of these kids. And so in a school, when you have different levels of population, that also requires different space constraints, different educational needs, different programming, et cetera. And so it's just, again, important to kind of keep that in mind as we think about what how each school looks in comparison to the other. So first, with special education, we have provided you with the 3 elementary schools along with the district average, the district K-3 average. So district K-3 average is the dotted line, Hastings is green, Fales is red, and Armstrong is blue. So the special education population has generally oscillated around 15%. It's slightly higher now. And generally, each of the elementary schools, I would say, has that level of special education identification. You can see there's a little bit of a separation happening the past year to include this year, where you have Hastings slightly above average, Armstrong slightly below average, and then Fales right in the middle. LEP is slightly different. The overall district K-3 average has stabilized probably around the 20% mark, but there is significant difference between the overall percent of population that are LEP at Hastings, which is significantly above the district average, versus Fales, which is significantly below the district average. And then you have Armstrong, which is pretty much tracking to the district K-3 average. So as we think about some of the scenarios, I think what we're also trying to consider is, are there ways to sort of rebalance out some of the additional needs that each school is seeing when it comes to some of their students? In terms of socioeconomic status, right, when we think about students who are coming from low income, again, thinking about the additional needs that they may need, we do see that the overall distribution across the Westborough town or city, rather, is somewhat focused on the northern, well, definitely the center, and then the northern portions of the city itself. Again, just indicating that if you strictly just go off of boundaries, there could be a variation between each of the 3 schools. And that is actually what we see. And so here, in terms of thinking about the low income distribution, what you have here, again, same type of thing. The dotted line represents your K-3 average. Again, Hastings, Armstrong, and Fales, you see that Hastings specifically is significantly higher percentage or representation in regards to their population. Armstrong slightly above average, and then Fales slightly below average. And again, this is just indicating what the current situation is across the three schools in regards to thinking about how best to make each school representative of Westborough at large. Okay, so before we're done with the landscape, we did want to kind of identify and talk really quickly about capacity of each of the three schools. And so part of the work that we did over the past couple weeks was to tag up with the principals and walk each building to basically get a sense of what the current capacity of each building is. And this was important because some of the current numbers, or rather the numbers that we had gotten from historical capacity measures, just seemed off in regards to what I think a lot of the principals, the district staff, sort of knew in regards to the buildings themselves. So what we endeavored to do was walk each building and understand from their current setup in regards to the general education classrooms and the special education classrooms, what if they were sort of in terms of their current setup established as the building's sort of instructional setup, how many kids could they technically educate at any one time? And I do want to emphasize, you have your general education classrooms and then you have your special education intensive rooms. And the reason why we focused on those specifically is because if you think about a child's day at school, they will generally have a seat or a desk somewhere in the school that is their desk that they will go to at the beginning of the day, throughout the day, and then back at the end of the day. So you need to sort of identify that specific starting and ending point. To that end, right, specific rooms are designated for that type of instructional programming. There is to say a lot more rooms than like what you're seeing here in terms of 22 rooms, but those you have to consider are office spaces, different pullout, or rather different programming for LEP, special education, reading, math interventions, all of those office spaces, your music, your gyms, all of those other designated spaces that are meant for specific purposes that serve specific needs, but that are not a solid space where one kid can sit for the entire day. So in this case, when it came to Armstrong, we walked around and we basically said, okay, each grade level has 5 designated classrooms, along with one additional general education classroom in case, you have a bulge in terms of enrollment as they move through. We also have one intensive room. That's one room designated for special education kids who they might not spend their entire time in a general education classroom, and so they have their own location in terms of a designated space. But it is important just to note that the district really emphasizes the inclusion of all students. And so even though we've identified a room where maybe the homeroom or their desk is specifically, that does not mean they spend their entire day there. A lot of the time is really being pushed into some of the general education classrooms. So if we determine that this is the sort of layout of the overall school, what we have are a couple assumptions that help feed into the capacity. One is that the max general education class size is 22 students. Your max intensive students with disability class is 8. And so if we do that, assuming 21 general education classrooms and 1, you do the math, and we basically get a number of 470 kids, could in theory be at capacity at Armstrong. So if you look at their current enrollment as of October 1st of 383, you have about a utilization of 81%. And so a couple of things that we also wanted to add for consideration was their current average class size is 19. This is an important piece of information because both Hastings and Armstrong have slightly average class sizes in comparison to Fales. They do have one designated space for a makerspace, meaning a room that has been identified and built out as a makerspace. And then in its current form, given the needs of the population as we've seen change, you have 2 designated rooms for LEP instruction. And again, those students are not always there throughout the entire day, but as they are provided additional programming, that's where they would go for additional programming. In terms of Fales, right, similar story. You have 5 classrooms per grade level. You have 1 additional general education room and 1 intensive room. So again, Fales and Armstrong actually have similar capacities of 470. Now, what's interesting well, let me get to that in a second. So with 470, you have the current enrollment of 281. And so their utilization is 60%, right? So you see a significant utilization difference between Fales and Armstrong. Couple additional considerations that I want to flag. Current average class size at Fales is 17. They also have a designated makerspace. Interestingly, because it's a new building and because it's a new design, they have additional instructional space outside of each classroom, which provides for, again, a different and potentially more opportunities for different instructional practices. They have one designated room for LEP instruction. And it's important to note, because Fales is bigger than just this, they actually house the district Students with Disabilities program, which is also co-located at Fales, right? So really in practice, we focused on essentially the rooms we could play with in terms of the capacity, but appreciating the fact that Fales actually does a lot of things for the district that is not currently represented here. And then finally, Hastings, slightly different setup. They have 5 kindergarten rooms, 4 first grade rooms, 5 second grade rooms, 4 third grade rooms. They have 1 additional gen ed room and then 2 intensive rooms. And that is given their current special education population, it was deemed that they needed 2 intensive rooms. And so again, using it off of that setup, their overall capacity is lower than Fales and Armstrong at 434. And if you look at their current utilization, it's at about 74%. Now, one of the things that I had mentioned in terms of to the school committee that seemed to resonate with them was 81% utilization at Fales is not equal to 81% utilization at Hastings. You have, or Armstrong for that matter. Excuse me, you have to remember that these buildings are different age, in terms of how they were built, what they were constructed as, what did it look like, and what was the priorities back when they were first built. And so it's important to note that the 80 utilization, it does look different based on the current facilities. Current average class size for Hastings is 19. This should read no designated makerspace. It is important to note that Hastings does have a makerspace program, but as we're thinking about potential opportunities, right, I think one of the opportunities here is thinking about, is it possible to get a space designated in Hastings for a makerspace to, again, make that sort of student experience similar across all 3 elementary schools. And then finally, they have 1 designated room for LEP instruction. All right, so that was the current landscape. I will pause very briefly to see if there's any questions. I do want to kind of get to the scenarios, but I think one question just popped up.
The question here is, what's the maximum utilization that each building should not exceed, assuming it's under 100?
No, it's a great question. So if you look, there's some different theories. Massachusetts generally says you kind of want between 80 and 90%. So the good news is, generally speaking, the overall utilization across all 3 schools, I think, is about 75 to 79%, which is not bad. When you think about utilization, again, you want to think about what does 85% utilization look like at Fales, and what does it look like at Hastings? So one of the activities that we're going to be doing here over the next month is to have different modeling of, like, okay, let's say Fales did go to 85 to 90%. What would that look like? Would that be prohibitive? Would it not be prohibitive? But what you also want to consider too in terms of utilization is, do you have enough space so that if and when new multifamily housing units come online and new families move in, do you have the space to basically catch those kids and not overly or dramatically affect different schools? So I will say it is not a hard and fast rule, but more of the context of your specific district based on what you know to be true, not only now, but in 5 to 10 years.
So there's a follow-up question that I think you kind of just answered, which is the ideal scenario to ensure consistent utilization across all 3 schools? And part of what we've been talking about internally is it may be wise to think about slightly different utilization rates if we know that development's going to skew toward one school or another in the future. So there's a bit of a balancing act we're engaged in.
Yeah, I mean, and thank you very much. And I think that's an excellent point, which I'll kind of get to here in the major takeaways, which I think will help inform exactly what you were saying. So, underutilized assets, right? What we know to be true based on some of the initial analyses that we've done is that the district is not currently maximizing its investment of the new Fales building, right? We're at 60% utilization. I think what is also compounding, I'm going to skip to number four real quick, right, is you have enrollment and demographic shifts that would suggest that that problem is not going to get better on its own, and it's actually going to add additional pressures to Armstrong and Hastings. So to the utilization point, yeah, we have to realign and then almost kind of guesstimate that, okay, it's not only going to happen, like, what is it now? But again, what do we think it's going to be in 5 to 10 years? So we have to sort of plan a little bit of accordingly around that. I do want to be careful. Inconsistent experience, again, for things like the makerspace, where programming does take place at Hastings, but they don't have a designated makerspace. And again, they're still getting the programming, but when we think about the constraints, and I learned this from the principal at Fales, right? When you start to think about rooms and classrooms, right, that does, even though they might have a better utilization or lesser enrollment, right? If you're maximizing the rooms, you only have so many rooms that you can kind of deal with. And so we have to kind of consider that when it comes to the overall, we'll call it the instructional design of each building. And then the representative skew of student demographics, right? Ideally, what we want to see is that each school is very representative of the Westborough population writ large. And so from that perspective, what we're seeing is that there are some demographic types that are being, there are variation across each school. And so now is kind of a good opportunity to say, okay, can we rebalance all three schools so that they are more representative? So that moves us to the scenarios. And so when we think about what the objectives were when we started to create the scenarios, right, we wanted to make sure that we balance our schools, which means shifting enrollment from one particular school to another. We did want to plan for tomorrow and thinking about these new developments and thinking about what trends are we seeing in terms of enrollment and demographics. We want to see parity in terms of what the access to class sizes and guidelines and programs and educational environment, making sure that we're maximizing to the best of our ability that similar experience. And then thinking about that one community and really trying to, again, balance out what we're seeing to be true across all student types. So what has to be true? So when we're thinking about these types of objectives and we're thinking about the goal, there were a couple things that we really wanted to establish. One was we're really talking about moving at least, and I stress the at least, 10% or 100 students of the K-3 population to Fales, right? And so when we're thinking about moving different sets of kids, we want to also consider the idea that we want to move from both Armstrong and Hastings so that we're kind of, again, taking an opportunity here to rethink what could be true at all three schools, not just one school. We do want to think about capacity buffers in terms of creating utilization flexibility, both at Armstrong and Hastings. And so in this regard, part of the conversation that we had with the school committee was really thinking about, can we or should we try to think about maybe creating a higher level capacity or rather utilization at Fales in comparison to Armstrong and Hastings, understanding that more than likely Hastings and Armstrong are probably going to see their overall utilization increase over the years. In terms of the geographical balance, as you saw, given some of the layout of Westborough, a lot of the population lives fairly far away from Fales. And that creates unique challenges when we're thinking about moving specific boundaries across three elementary schools that, for all intents and purposes, are pretty close to one another. So what that means in terms of thinking about what Westborough has already done is around this idea of satellite boundaries. And I'll give a quick definition here in a second, but it's really thinking about, are there opportunities to have different multifamily housing units actually go to Fales or attend Fales versus some of the other schools if it doesn't sort of stop what is normally, like in terms of walking to different locations, we don't want to sort of disrupt that. But if it is a minimal to no disruption of a student going to Fales versus going to another school, then ultimately at the end of the day, it's something we should really think about. And then obviously space for programming, right? As we think about the idea of, again, leaning on this, can we get a designated makerspace in Hastings? That means we do have to move a classroom, or rather move enough enrollment to open up a classroom at Hastings. So in terms of scenario development, I want to be extremely just upfront, right? This is only modeling SY 25-26 student residency. We just wanted to start really big picture. We're not considering special education needs at the moment because ultimately, at the end of the day, we're trying to think big picture in terms of movement of kids. We were aiming initially for this 81% until we started to talk to you all and talking to the school committee. And what we're really hoping to kind of get from you all is this idea of what is your first impression based on a lot of these scenarios. These scenarios more than likely will not be what gets submitted to the school committee in January. This is merely a foundational starting point, right? For any of these types of things, you have to start somewhere. And what we tried to do across the 5 scenarios is give you different perspectives and different looks, given what we knew to be true in regards to what I think some people were suggesting or some people were thinking. So part of these scenarios are just meant to create conversation. Part of them are to get your reaction. Part of them are to really consider trade-offs. Because at the end of the day, when we're thinking about scenario development, there is this key point around what do you have to give up for something to happen or for something to be true. So as I sort of promised really quickly, when we're talking about the 2 types of movements of regions, one was a satellite boundary. This is a satellite boundary is a designated neighborhood or specifically multifamily housing complex assigned to a school that is physically separated from the school's main attendance zone. So here, again, Westborough Village, right, is not connected to the main Fales boundary, but you can see that they are considered a part of Fales. And so from that perspective, we think of them as, far off a satellite, but are getting transported. We also considered additional regions, and we just needed naming conventions, so bear with me. An additional region is a specific neighborhood directly next to a school's existing boundary, right? And so there are a couple instances where you'll see we started to expand overall Fales boundary by expanding the existing boundary, and we look at that slightly differently than the satellite boundary. All right. So to that point, we're going to go through the 5 scenarios. Again, I do want to emphasize a couple things. One is we've provided as much data as we feel is helpful in regards to these scenarios at the end of this presentation. For each scenario, I give you a quick summary along with what I felt were some of the biggest takeaways, but I'm not going to try to inundate you with tables upon tables upon tables of numbers because it can be overwhelming. But I encourage everybody to go in and take some time to look through those slides. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to shoot myself an email. My email is I will add it to, I'll make sure it's posted and I'll make sure it's posted. I know it's posted on the resources and I know most of the other presentations I have my email as well, but by all means, if you have questions, concerns, thoughts, that is why my email is there, is for everybody to sort of engage. So scenario 1, and I just want to call out it's 6:40, so I'm going to go through this scenarios in about 5-6 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to the broader community for questions and comments. But scenario 1 was establishing essentially 2 new satellite zones, one from Armstrong and one from Hastings, along with an expanded region. And so we basically tried to identify a couple different, again, multifamily housing units and regions that would be beneficial for this sort of scenario. And I did want to emphasize when we're thinking about sort of what makes for an ideal region or an ideal satellite boundary, we need it to be of a certain or particular size, right? You don't want to waste when we're thinking about trying to minimize financial impact. We need to have a 1 bus instead of going from, say, Park Westborough to Armstrong. It can simply just redivert from Park West to Fales. And if you have too big of a satellite boundary, then you might have to split up buses, and we don't want to have too many buses. We don't want to have a split community going to one school and one to another school. So we're trying to think of that right-sized community that can basically encompass 1 bus, but that stays together as a neighborhood so that we're not splitting up neighborhoods. So in this case, 3 satellite boundaries, Park, Homestead, and again, Westborough Village, which is existing. We had the additional region, which is Armstrong South, which runs just south of the 30. And then considerations, given this sort of scenario, we see Fales utilization increases to 80%. It has a markedly improved demographic balance and basically reduces that variation across the three elementary schools. And again, does what we're hoping to do, which is increasing or freeing up that instructional space at Hastings so that they might have some more space to play with. I do also want to point out, sorry, I should have mentioned this. Anything that is new is usually highlighted here in red. So red, 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 meaning they're all coming to Fales. Scenario 1A would be just adding this concept of, okay, what if you didn't do park, but you just expanded that regional boundary further, right? Because now part of, again, thinking about trade-offs is, do you just expand the boundary or do you try to think creatively around these satellite boundaries and thinking about what could be true if we were to think of that? So to show you the trade-off of like, okay, we're not going to do park, but we'll just do expand the boundaries. We don't quite get an increase in terms of fails up to that 80% mark. Again, this is sort of emphasized, and this probably is not too big of a surprise. The amount of area you need to encompass the same amount of kids as you would in terms of some of these multifamily housing units is pretty significant. And that's some of the challenge that we have to face is thinking about, okay, how do we think about what logically makes for a good region? How do we expand out from that? So on and so forth. So wouldn't quite get us up to Fales 80% mark. Doesn't actually change the demographic profile much of Fales or Armstrong, and then still frees up that instructional space at Hastings because from Hastings experience, they're still reallocating the Homestead multifamily housing unit. Scenario 2, in much the same way, tries to re-envision, okay, well, what if instead of moving a multifamily housing unit from Hastings to Fales, we try to essentially make the downtown whole? And so what if we were to move these pieces of the puzzle to the town to Armstrong? We take Arrive, which is a more significant sized multifamily housing unit, and send them to Fales. And I should have mentioned too, any number you see beyond the regions and the satellites are the number of PK, or rather kindergarten to 3 enrollment. And so here, if we were to do this, you again get back up to that Fales utilization of 81%. This is sort of a mixed, this is the challenges that we're facing. You significantly increase the diversity at Fales, which is good, but then you're actually concentrating the demographics at Armstrong. So again, part of this is trading off is you're creating a more diverse experience for the Fales, but you're reducing that experience for Armstrong. But then you free up instructional space at Hastings, again, thinking about what that could look like. Scenario 3, we knew there probably was going to be a question around, well, what if you just did regions, right? Like ignore the adding additional multifamily housing. And so to remotely get close to that 80% utilization at Fales, we would have to encompass basically the southern portion of 30 of Armstrong, a significant portion of downtown, and then this sort of area right here for Hastings that was originally given up to Fales a couple of years ago, and then we would be repurposing them back. You would hit that 80% utilization, but essentially Fales and the overall student enrollment would be extremely homogeneous. There we go. In terms of being not exactly diverse, it does not look like overall Westborough, and so it would create a sort of, I think, an issue in terms of what Fales looks like in comparison to the other two schools. Does free up space at Hastings, but then again is not really encompassing this challenge of we know new multifamily housing units are coming in, and so how do we balance that sort of need in the couple years that we're expecting Armstrong and Hastings to sort of adjust in terms of their enrollment? And then finally, in the event that basically we did not have any satellite boundaries, what would have to be true? And so I'm sorry, this should be blue so Westborough would go back to Armstrong. And so you would have to basically reproportion all of the west portion of Armstrong to Fales along with the southern portion of Hastings. And so that even wouldn't get you up to 76% in terms of utilization. Continues to really reemphasize this significant demographic isolation at Fales, does free up some space at Hastings. But then starts to play the game of, well, you're moving kids out of Fales to go to Hastings when the whole point was to get kids to go to Hastings. And so part of this challenge too is you don't necessarily want to be moving kids left, right, up, and down just to account for different demographic shifts. So those were our initial 5 scenarios that we started with. Again, I just really want to emphasize part of these are just to test out different solutions and to see what constraints or what kind of challenges that we'd be facing. And so, yes, excellent. So it is 6:45. Would love to open up the floor. I know we have some more questions in the chat, but would love to open it up for comments, questions, and concerns.
Yeah, I want to make sure for people who put questions in that we kind of covered those answers adequately first. So any folks in there who have any follow-up, you can either type it or unmute yourself and let us know.
Hey, good evening. I guess I'd like to ask kind of a two-part question. Can everyone hear me okay?
We
Loud
can
and
hear you
clear.
great. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, I guess, the first part is in regards to incumbent students that have spent time in their current elementary school for 1 year, 2 years, fostered their education there, and really created community there, both for themselves and also contributed to the community of the school. As we know, all students after their tenure at the elementary schools will revisit one another and work together and attend together at Mill Pond. But I guess I'm just, thinking about students that have spent that amount of time. Let's say a student is in second grade, they spent 2 years, they've made friends. They're well equipped to navigate the school, to that they're using all the resources to foster their education. And there is concern that I've observed amongst parents about taking a child away from an elementary school at that stage. As we know, and as is easily observed, the effects of a child to switch schools, especially switching schools presumably twice in 2 years. If they're in second grade, they go to, let's say, from one school, Hastings, to Fales, and then Fales to Mill Pond. There's a number of stressors in making that change. There's a lot of environmental considerations where they have to readapt, things like that. I want to know from the school committee perspective, what are the considerations there? And what are we thinking about proactively for students that fall into that bucket?
I can uh Nick, if you're okay, I can take a partial crack at
Always.
this, and then I will say this study is really trying to identify a kind of a good solution for sustainability for enrollment across these 3 buildings, but it doesn't really speak to the implementation part, which I think is what you're getting at, because it's a change, and a change in the life of a very small person. And so one of the reasons we're moving quickly through this process and hoping to have a school committee decision in late January, early February, is it then creates time for us to do things that we know work in terms of creating a sense of community. So making sure that students have opportunities to visit, that there are sort of activities that happen with the new schools in mind and things like that. I've been through this process in a different district, and that part is as important, if not more important, than getting the numbers right. So I think that's a big piece of what we're thinking about, and we'll be thinking about more in the days ahead. And hopefully really tapping into the parent communities, the parent groups, to help us with that effort. I think they are well equipped to make sure not just students, but whole families feel like they can be welcomed into a new school and a new school environment.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll sort of add, I think, 2 considerations. So part of the recommendations at the end of January not only will be about the plan, but about the implementation as well. And so part of the constraints that are tied to implementation, right, are, to your point, I think some of the considerations around grade or age sort of shifts and how many times a kid could change. But then it's also financially, what can be sort of managed in terms of grandfathering and thinking about what that looks like. And then, part of the reason or really one of the main reasons why we wanted to have the strategic working group was to really help start to think through that. Once we start to solidify on what are potential scenarios, what does that implementation and what does that exchange look like? So part of it is really, the work actually just begins starting in January when we're thinking about the supports in terms of the groups, in terms of the activities that can be really implemented at the end of this year, across the summer, and into next year as well when we're thinking about that. So that is by no means, it was not touched upon too much tonight because we're really talking about the scenarios, but the implementation piece will be a big part of that come January.
There's a question here about that issue, Nick, that you raised about kind of the rolling in enrollment versus sort of having kind of a, go time next September. And, you mentioned finances. I don't know if from what you've seen in the past in your experience, is it kind of what are the constraints? What are the things that would determine whether we're able to do one versus the other?
I would say usually the biggest financial driver in some of these challenges is around transportation, right? So when we're thinking about, let's use Park. I'm just using that as an example. Park, and let me actually pull it up so you can kind of see the example. Okay. Well, we can use Arrive too. Let's say Arrive was currently Arrive is going to Armstrong. So let's say we say, okay, well, everybody is gonna from Arrive go to Fales except for third grade. Whereas before we could send two buses to pick up all of the Arrive kids and send them to Fales, now we would actually have to find a third bus because that you would have two buses that are picking up most of the kids from Arrive and sending them to Fales, but then that other additional bus would then pick up the third graders, for instance, if they were grandfathered in and send them to Armstrong. And so a couple things, right? We may or may not actually have the buses to do that. We may not actually have the resources to pay the bus drivers and the fuels because usually each route of a bus can be fairly expensive and prohibitive, as well as then thinking about, in terms of the constraints at Armstrong in regards to their utilization, we would want to be careful in terms of making sure that we're not making a problem worse. So those are all the things that as we start to, again, solidify towards a specific set of scenarios, we'll be able to model out a little bit better to sort of engage with the district around what is possible and feasible.
There's another question about whether kind of what way the school committee is leaning at this point, and I'm looking to see, I don't know if any of them are on the call. I would say these are very preliminary, and Nick shared these scenarios just on Wednesday night last week. In general, people were there was a lot of discussion around the first couple scenarios that do involve satellite boundaries, and I think part of that, there are two real reasons to that. One is that I think it was seen as kind of strategically a way to think about school enrollment in school districts and enrollment areas in a way that plans for the future, right? So because we know we have these additional projects coming online, this sort of keeps that option open for us into the future. And then secondly, again, had to do with wanting to make sure each school of our K-3 schools is broadly representative of the town, that all of our schools kind of look like Westborough as a whole. I think there was some conversation about that. Anything else missing on that one, Nick?
Only a couple of them mentioned that they would like to think about scenario one. There was some interest in scenario two where making the downtown whole, I know, came into being. So it is important to note, come tomorrow, we'll be publishing a couple things. One, an interactive web app of scenario one to get people's perspective. And that's basically, and you can feel free to, well, the nice part is you can highlight different areas within the map. You can see what boundaries we're talking about. You can provide comments about each specific area. You can take it as multiple times as you want. But it's for a way for us to really kind of tie down a geographical sort of vision of what you're thinking in terms of what your comments are. We're also going to, over this next week, start to think about how to engage a lot of these either regions or multifamily housing units. specifically around if they were to move. And so we're going to do some very explicit outreach in regards to these areas to get input around their considerations and their thoughts in terms of the matter. But I do want to say the school committee was very interested in hearing, hearing feedback from specific individuals and the community at large about some of these different ideas and concepts.
There's one question in the chat here. I don't know if you can see this, Nick, where pointing to I guess it's the southwest corner of what's currently the Hastings district, and just asking, what sort of student yields would come to Fales if that portion was.
Are we talking about right here?
Yes, exactly.
Yep. So that would be, I have it here somewhere. Hold on. Southern Hastings, about 40 kids. I do want to flag it's 7:55. Nope, 6:55. There we are. We can certainly follow up with the frequently asked questions if people have written it down, but I do want to give opportunity. Does anybody want to jump on and sort of voice? I appreciate, Mike, your comments. Are there other folks that would like to sort of take some airtime?
Yeah, Nick, appreciate you here sharing the data. I think this is great work that you and the team at Dillinger have done. I think for the committee here, I've got to really emphasize the false urgency, I think, that we're creating. We've got a number of schools here, none at utilization, even at the target here that we heard from Nick at 80 to 90%. And I think the magnitude of the decision that we're considering here, I mean, this is truly a once in a decade type decision that'll affect hundreds of families. And I think we've just, as a community, probably need some more time to digest this. And I think if we look across Massachusetts and districts facing similar challenges, we've seen extended periods of community engagement. We've seen multiple rounds of feedback, interactive tools for families to understand the impacts, advisory councils working through the implementation. And, I think as a whole, having a full year for affected families to plan. I mean, that in and of itself, moving schools, guys, impacts childcare arrangements, transportation logistics, work schedules, sibling coordination. Families as a whole need time. And so I think these scenarios are great. And I know we're trying to plan for, 4 additional housing developments that are, currently under construction or coming online. But I think guessing at their impact is a little bit of a bit of a game that we might not want to get into as a community, right? And I just think that as we take a moment here, there is no emergency, right? Rushing this increases the chances that we get it wrong and have to do it again in 5 years. And so I think just taking a moment here and really thinking about this, maybe differently. First, approach this, develop some legacy student provisions, right? Start to think about, the folks that are going to have to, as Mike touched on, the children that are going to have to make 2 transitions in as many years. The science is out there. We've seen the studies, the impact that this has on childhood development and their education is significant. And I think that having a community that's approaching that in a thoughtful way, as opposed to kind of rushing into something, would be, beneficial to us as a whole, both for obviously the students who are the most important here, but also for the families, for staff, teachers, all of them, administrators should be brought into the conversation, again, with some more thought and time to really think about the best way to approach this. So my feeling on this would just be, establishing a redistricting implementation advisory council. I know, Dillinger, you've done a fair amount of work in Andover. I think you look at that model, it makes a lot of sense. They really stopped to think about the impact to the children. And again, I understand the district wants to better utilize Fales. That's a legitimate goal. But achieving that goal 1 or 2 years later with proper planning and family protections is vastly better than rushing and creating unnecessary hardship. So I think as we go across this, I'd ask you guys to think a little bit more about the overall approach. There is no, unless there's something that I'm missing, there is no state requirement. There's no facility deadlines. There's no capacity crisis that I think I'm not missing in the data. So from where I sit and from what I'm hearing from a lot of these other parents, the only timeline pressure is the ones that we've created ourselves. And if that's the case, I think it would be worthwhile to give families, a little bit more time to get this right and make sure that we've got all of our ducks in a row before implementing one of these plans. So just want to echo that, Nick. I think this is great work for the committee. I think we've got to pause for a moment and think about the impact to our children.
Jonathan, thank you for that. I just want to acknowledge that comment, and something that for the school committee, I can make sure to relay to them so that that's a real consideration for them as we think about, if, coming up with possible solutions is one fact, the kind of timeline for implementation is another. And certainly your advice to slow down is something we can take into very serious consideration. I saw Owen had a hand up. And do we have time for one more, Nick, before?
How about we do Owen and Jenny, if like 7:01, but yes, let's if we could keep it, mildly short, but to the point. But yes, that would be great.
Thank you, guys.
Let's do it.
Yeah, thanks so much. I was just sort of going to echo a lot of what Jonathan just said, and sort of what Jared just put in the chat a question or two ago, and sort of wondering whether it makes sense to sort of on a rush timeline like this, sort of make some of these permanent decisions, not knowing exactly what that future housing is going to look like, especially when none of our buildings are being overutilized right now. I'm wondering if it really, as Jonathan said, makes sense to be doing this right at the moment, projecting out what that future housing could look like, rather than just saying, as that housing comes in, let's make decisions about that housing accordingly, rather than, making our 7 and 8-year-olds sort of fix this issue, as current students.
Thank you. And then Jenny?
Okay, so I'm going to do something totally not Jenny tonight. And I just want to say that I feel like this process has been really well thought out. And for those of you who don't know, I have 4 children. One is at Mill Pond, 2 at Hastings, one that will be going into his 3rd grade year next year. And I appreciate the fact that right now, I feel like everyone is deeply thinking about my children and trying to do this in a way that acknowledges that it will be a transition for all of them. And down the road, if we wait another 5 years, I have someone else that will be going into the schools. And no matter when we do this, this will affect my children. And at the end of the day, we moved to Westborough because we have such wonderful schools. And while I don't want to leave where I am right now, I do love that they went to Dillinger and hired this company that is doing their best to work the best for all of us. And I just felt like that was maybe something that I've been following this, as Allison knows, and has been a part of everything. I'm one of the parent group presidents at Hastings. And I just think that it's important to give positive accolades and acknowledgement to all the hard work that has gone in thus far with the committee you guys have created and everything. So I just wanted to say thank you from my perspective.
Thank you, Jenny. I appreciate that. And I do appreciate, I know this is, we are talking about these things in numbers terms, but there are people's, children, and I can see one in the background right now. Hello. We want this to acknowledge the sort of feelings part of this and the transition, and to work for kids first and foremost. That's always what we're looking to do. Other questions, I'll pull anything we found in the chat that we didn't get to and make sure we get back to you. And again, I dropped both Nick's email address and my own in the chat. Nick, do you have any final words of advice? You've been through this in other districts as well, so
No, and I appreciate all the comments, to include the let's slow down to thinking about how we can creatively use potentially new developments and all of those types of things. I please encourage everybody to contribute and to email me, because I know the school committee, that was one of the biggest things, was the school committee wants to hear from everybody. And so please, please, please continue to put forth those A, good ideas, and B, comments. I mean, that's what we want to hear. So thank you.
Great. I think that is it. Thank you so much for spending this time with us tonight. And we will be sending out some additional survey, I think within the next week or so, another sort of another
24
way
hours.
of problem, even faster. I love this about you guys. Also, just I wanted to give a shout out. Katie did pop into the Zoom at one point. So Nick's the data whiz, who's really helping us look at all this stuff very carefully, was in the room for a bit. And I don't know if she's still here, but she's wonderful. And finally, do keep reaching out. Come to school committee, reach out to your school committee reps. That's what they're there for. And everyone have a great evening and stay warm, please.